I wanted to do a different video today, and this one's kind of weird. This one gets kind of into the engineering and mathematics of a motor, and how you would go about selecting some of the components for the valve train. And that's what I'm working on. I did this particular spreadsheet ages ago, and because I was changing some components pretty significantly. If you've seen some of the other videos, you know that I was running a hydraulic lifter setup, and the hydraulic lifter being a slightly heavier component, you think, well, maybe I need to go to a higher pressure valve spring. This happens to be a higher pressure valve spring. There's a factory valve spring, but you don't really know for sure. So the general thought is that if you go and you read the SAMA and you jump in there and you say, hey, I'm changing my valve train around, everybody says, oh, just throw a heavy-duty valve spring in there, And the trick is with these heavy-duty valve springs is they're heavy-duty. I mean, do you really need this? They're going to wear your motor out pretty quickly, and I wasn't really building a hot motor. I was building a mileage motor. I wanted to be able to drive it and cruise. It needed to be a comfortable, reliable type of motor. So I wanted to be able to justify not using the high pressure valve spring. So you have to kind of look at it and make a couple of assumptions. First of all, I know that my old motor used to be able to hit about 5,000 RPMs, and it sounded okay, so I figured it wasn't valve floating. So let's assume that I can hit 5,000. So you have to look at some of your components. So start with a valve train. This little guy right here, this is a retainer. This is a factory retainer, about 17.5 grams. Now, I don't actually have a valve for me, but this is the mass of one of the valves that I took out of the car when I just rebuilt it. And I did this spreadsheet so long ago that I don't even remember what I was thinking about when I wrote down tip. But I must have measured something, so I'm going to leave it in there. The valve spring, this is a factory valve spring. So I just weighed this today, and I weighed this guy, because between the time that I put this spreadsheet together and actually deciding that I wanted to do this video about like 6 months ago, I started doing some research onto how much of the mass of this spring actually gets incorporated into the calculations. And it turns out that you take about 1/3 of the mass of your valve spring. So this is the valve spring mass. My total discounts this. So this is clearly the 66 and 52 is roughly that. So I've taken care of it here. So this is the total with 1/3 of the spring mass. Now, this is the part of the valve train that goes fast. This is the part of the valve train right here that goes the speed of the camshaft. So you have to ratio your masses by what your ratio rocker is. I used to run a 1-1 rocker. So assuming there's a certain amount of energy contained in here, you take the 1-1, the energy of course would be 1.2, it's a square function, and it gives you a multiplier. So you have to increase your mass by this number to get to this. This gives you an effective mass for the high speed part of your valve train. Then you got the low speed part of the valve train, which is your lifter and a push rod. It gives me a sum of my mass. I assume that my spring had enough energy to do the job. So we start with some kind of energy. In this particular case, I'm just going to make it the square of this number right there. I've got a certain amount of energy per unit of mass, which is ratioed down, and then 5,000 RPMs. And then you have to start changing your components. So my new system, if I take out my old retainer, and one of the things that I did decades ago, believe it or not, was I bought, I believe, either an aluminum or a titanium retainer. And it turns out those retainers weigh 8 grams. So that buys me some RPMs. Now I'm running a bigger valve on the new motor. I went out, one of the things about valves is a bigger valve has a certain sound relative to the smaller valve. I like the sound of a big valve. It's kind of an ego thing. It doesn't really help the motor. It doesn't need it, but it just sounds really good. You crank it up, you open the throttles, it sounds good. So I've got a bigger valve. which weighs 77.95. Oh, and now I've gone the other direction. Now I can't go as fast as I used to. The tip is going to stay the same. These guys tell me that I need to run this guy. Now this is my high. I'm going to get to the springs later, but I'm not actually going to run that spring. I'm going to keep my spring that one. So I'm not going to change it. That gives me this, my ratio. I'm down right now. My lifter, and I weighed the lifters, are quite a bit heavier. 95. Oops. 95.99. But here's the trick. Imagine this is the interior, like this is a see-through valve lifter. All right, your factory valve has a push rod that fits down in there, something like that. And then you have a hydraulic lifter. Well, they put a valve body on the inside of it. So rather than the push rod going down that far, the push rod goes down this far, which means I can have a shorter push rod with my hydraulic lifter. And it turns out that my custom adjusted and shortened push rods are actually only 37 grams, so I get some of it back. That gets me, there's some of my mass, my energies, this, anyway, I'm at 4,900, so I can't run it as fast as I used to be able to run based on what I've got right now. So you say, well, what do I need to do in order to get up to what I used to be able to do? I mean, I don't want my valve float. Well, if you look in the Samba, anybody will tell you, oh, you're running ratio rockers, you got to go with one of these guys. Because, well, you're altering things in such a way that you have to run one of these guys. I mean, it's just common knowledge, right? And it turns out that they're wrong. That if you run a higher ratio rocker arm, by accelerating only half of the valve train versus the other, you've actually helped yourself. I mean, you compress the spring harder, which stores more energy. If you're storing more energy in this, you can run a higher velocity valve train. Everything else being equal. So if I put 1.25 in here, which is the ratio of my new rockers, you'll see that I suddenly jump up to 5,200 RPM. So even though I've got a heavier valve train, by running a ratio rocker on my new valve train, I can actually run as high as I used to be able to go. So I don't need to use the big fat spring. I can use this spring, which is what I want. The motor's going to last longer with this spring versus the heavy duty spring. And it's something that you guys need to think about. You don't have to run the big spring. Do a little thought, put a little thought into it, and you'll realize that the factory spring is actually pretty solid. I mean, this thing can get the job done a lot of different ways. Now, I wanted to do a couple of other things because I've got other things on this particular spreadsheet. So anyway, when I got my hydraulic kit from Mafoco, there's Mafoco right there. All right, they came with these. This is a chromoly push rod. It's custom length to replace a factory setup, factory 1600 setup with the hydraulic lifters. So it's a custom length, pre-configured, very nice. I like that he did a good job with these things. But the point is, I don't need a chromoly push rod. So if you stick a chromoly push rod in here, look what happens to your RPMs. What do we get? 65, 14. Bang! All of a sudden, with that big old, this rod, I drop 225 RPMs, a fair amount. But we don't need that. We just don't need it. We're not going fast enough. We don't have a high pressure spring. There's just no reason to go with a chromoly push rod. So I've got a set of these guys that are just sitting down there in my garage. No point to have them. The heads that I bought, I took out. This is one of the high pressure springs that came with the heads that I got. If you looked at the other videos, you know that I've got some fairly decent Mafoco heads. But I knew that these were going to go, so I took the high pressure springs out and replaced them with a set of these guys. So I'm back to running factory springs in there. But let's take a look at the camshaft. So this is a bunch of camshaft information. So my hydraulic kit from from Moco came with a cam, and I wanted to see some of its specs. So these are the lifts in millimeters, and you'll notice that they're pretty uniform. And so it's a .278 lift, which means this is pretty close to the factory cam, which is what I expected. But look at these base circles. 0.6, 0.27, 0.23. Look at the gap between these two right there. This is a brand new camshaft, the big gap. Right. Maybe that's the way they come, maybe not. Right now I've got my car seat. I bought my car seat one decades ago. Thing's got anywhere from 80 to 100,000 miles on it. So you'll see these two are pretty close. That one's kind of in there. This guy's worn a little bit, but there's some gaps. So here's some wear. If you look at the lifts, notice how these lifts are all really pretty close. Look at my lift. Look at the gap between these two lifts right here. That's 0.4 of a millimeter. So I've got some wear on my lobes, and it kind of tells. But I've got more lift in that cam than you get from the factory. And I also happen to have a crane cam of some sort. I have no idea what it was, but I bought it brand new. I figured it was brand new, so I did the measurements on it as well. So these are the base circle measurements. And notice that the gap between the big and the small, that's super tight. Very, very tight. And then look at the lifts between the big and the small. Super tight. So I would say this is a very high quality camshaft. A crane. I don't even know if they're in business anymore. But really nice, high quality cam. And based on the fact that these numbers are really, really tight, and these numbers are really, really not tight, I'm going to say that this is a brand new cam or a brand new billet, and that is a reground cam. So my kit from car seat, not from car seat, but from Mofoco came in. Then I've got a reground cam that I'm not using. I've got chromoly push rods that I'm not using. And the heads that I got from Mofoco came with a retainer and a valve spring that I'm not using. So I got a lot of components from Mofoco that I'm just not using. I'm not knocking the Mofoco stuff. I really like the heads. I really like the hydraulic lifters. But yeah, the kits that I got contain components that I'm just not going to use. And I'm trying to think, is there anything else? Yes, there is one other thing that I forgot to talk about. I wanted to do a little bit specifically about the valve springs. So let's take a look at the valve springs themselves. All right, one of these numbers is incorrect. The small spring, the big spring is 45.52. 45.52. Control C, Control V, point, get rid of that. Okay, I've got a high strength spring and a low strength spring. So you think this is a heavy duty spring, this is going to be heavier than this guy right here. But if you look at the masses, the strong spring is 45 and the weak spring is 52. So how is it that my strong spring weighs less than my weak spring? But if you line these things up, here's what you look at. Count the number of bindings. As you go up, this has got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bindings. This has got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I've got bindings, not bindings, they're windings. So I've got 6 windings here, I've got 5 windings here. So this guy's got like 1 extra binding or 20% more metal in it. This one does versus this one. So if you take the 4, 5 and you multiply it by 20%, you get this. Well, this is slightly more than that. So where does the extra mass come from with this guy right here? So if you look at the retainers, which are designed to cover the springs, the Mofoco retainer, this guy over here, the Mofoco retainer is ever so slightly larger in diameter, which means that this spring is ever so slightly larger in diameter. So it's a slightly bigger spring to make up for it. Now, it's going to have a higher installed height, which means it's going to have greater pressure throughout the entire range, which is what you would expect with a higher RPM spring. One of the things I don't like about this particular spring is if you look at the windings down in here and up in here, you'll see that there's absolutely no variance, top to bottom. And what you should see in a high quality spring, like your factory spring, is a very tight binding down in here. And when you come up to the top, it's going to be a bit looser. So you've got a loose side and you've got a tight side. And what you get is when you compress the spring, these coils have a tendency to collapse. They collapse on top of themselves and they take themselves out of the force equation, which means when you start, it's fairly weak, And as the spring compresses, I mean, I can't do it, but as the spring compresses, you end up picking up more and more force over fewer and fewer pieces of the coil. So this ends up becoming what they call a progressive spring. This is a linear spring. And if you really, really want to run high performance, or even, I'm not running high performance, but if you want the best life out of your valve train components, you want the progressive spring. So maybe you take this guy to the drag strip, but if you want life, if you want to be able to drive your car, cruise 180, 50, how many 100,000 miles you want to throw in your car, this is not the way to go. You've really got to have something like this. This is the ticket right there. Now, coming back over here to the retainers, and this guy being 8, I've looked around. I don't know whether CB Performance sold a titanium lifter. So it's entirely possible that that lifter, sorry, the retainer, this retainer over there, that guy is made out of aluminum. And I'm pretty sure CB Performance doesn't sell aluminum retainers anymore. But I'm telling you, I got 80 to 100,000 miles on that retainer. And it's aluminum. But it's sitting on top of a factory weaker spring. So, and it managed to survive the test of time. Now, there is one thing that I'm missing in here, and what's some way I can show you? Okay, you've got the rocker arm. Notice that I do not have a component up here that lists the rocker arm. So the rocker arm would sit there like this. It goes up and down like that. The tip of it, of course, is going to travel pretty much 1.25 times what this end does, because you've got a 125 ratio. And but the trick is, how do I determine the rotational moment of inertia of a rocker arm? And that I don't know how to do. So there is a component in here that would determine that. By taking it, it would fall mostly on the ratio side. It would damage us, it would hurt us a little bit to do it that way. But even though if you had to drop 10%, I could lose 10% and I would still be above my 5,000. One other thing that you need to think about is, let's go back to thinking about the springs. Now, when you start talking about valve float, you think, okay, I'm going so fast that my valve is going to just float off the nose. And if you read about it a little bit, what you'll realize is that that's not really what causes valve float. Valve float happens before you get to the point at which theory would predict that you're going to float off the nose of the cam. And the reason it does that is because you end up getting, if I can imagine this, imagine you've got your push rod, your assembly right there, and he's bouncing up and down like this. This causes vibration through all of this stuff. And what you get are little oscillations, teeny tiny oscillations that begin to, they build up inside your valve springs. And if you get one of these little oscillations that causes just a little bit of a valve twist at the wrong point as you're going over that nose, just the vibrations, the clatter of your valve train can cause the valve to pop off the nose. So you pop off your nose, not because you've hit the point at which valve float should happen, but because you've got vibration in your valve train. So what you get with the hydraulic lifter that you don't get with the solid lifter, this is another reason why I like hydraulic lifters, I really do like my hydraulic lifters, is that I've got all this vibration running around my valve train, but what I've got down in here, imagine my finger being what's in there. What's in there is a bunch of oil. And, if you ask yourself, what is inside a shock absorber for your car? Well, they fill shock absorbers with oil. So what you've got is essentially a shock absorber for your valve train sitting down in there. So it's not just that you don't have to adjust your valves all that often. You've got a shock absorber on your valve train. So your entire valve trains run smoother, which means the entire process, everything in your valve train is now, due to the shock absorbing, is going to last longer. Okay, sorry for the kind of discontinuity there. Apparently my new camera likes to cut off after 20 minutes. I mean, it's not a video recorder, it's a camera. And it's got some built-in cutoff. So, got a little bit of editing issue here. But anyway, we were talking about valve train and vibration, and I was pretty much done, but between finishing that and starting to process it, I realized I didn't talk about another contributor to valve train vibration that I've seen people use, and you don't really think about it, but it's the straight cut cam gear set. And of course they make a ton of noise, and you do realize that the noise indicates a vibration. And if you're running basically a low performance, we're talking about anything 4, 5, 6,000 RPM, I'm telling you, there's no reason to do that. That vibration gets into your valve train, it causes oscillations to build up in your springs, and you're going to float because you've got massive amounts of vibration coming from that cam. Sorry, not the cam, but from its drive mechanism. You just don't want to run that kind of a vibrating item inside that kind of a system. It's just not done. You need smooth. Smooth gives you longevity. The vibration, your components are going to wear out. I understand why you use these things. I've got super high pressure valve springs. This causes a lot of side thrust on the bearings. But we're running this guy, a low strength spring. You just don't need to worry about the side thrust. They've taken care of that. It's all been engineered out. Just not something you need to worry about. But I think I've talked about everything I need to talk about. Doesn't mean it's complete. If you don't like what I've said, comments. If I left something out, comments. Like I say, it's one of my pet peeves here, is the engineering of the vehicle. And you just head over to the SAMA, and there's lots of stuff running around, but there's not much engineering that runs around. There's not much math. And some math went into the selection of the components of my motor. And just wanted to share it with you a little bit. That's all I got for now. More later.